Let's get this thing started. Hello, everybody. This is Matt Burford from Tactical Faith. This is our second or third Hangout. We're here with Dr. Richard Howe and Dr. Tim McGrew, Robert Hall, and Brad Swiger. We all represent either professors or local apologetic leaders, and we're just here to have an informal talk. I see already that we have 4 or 5 people watching other than us. If you want me to ask a question from you, you can feel free to email me at mattburford@gmail.com, and I'll ask those questions. But other than that, I appreciate you coming aboard, Dr. Howe. I know that Apologetic 315 interview yesterday was pretty productive. I listened to it this morning, and as usual, Brian does a really good job of getting to the heart of things and asking pretty good questions.
Absolutely. He made it very, very easy. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be involved.
Yeah, he does a really fabulous job. What I like about Apologetics 315 is the fact that, you know, he brings on people that represent so many different areas of apologetics. And let me ask you one thing about that interview. Hello, everybody. This is Matt Burford from Tactical Faith. Sorry. This is our second or third hangout. Hold on. That was my voice coming back to me. All right. One of the questions I wanted to ask you first was in regards to that interview. You had talked about the intersection of philosophy and Christianity. That's something that you really like to look at. In terms of local church apologetics and the local church groups that are around in different communities, how best do you integrate philosophy into your walk, either into your personal walk or even into, let's just say there's a community leader at his church. I mean, does he teach a class on philosophy? I mean, can he teach a class on logic? I mean, how do we as local leaders integrate philosophy?
Well, I actually have a talk that I've done and love to do that goes by 2 different titles. The more straightforward title is How Theology Needs Philosophy. But it has a softer title, How Philosophy Can Help Your Theology, because I discovered, even in my own local church experience over the years, that people have a suspicion about whatever they perceive philosophy to be. So I don't want to just come across so strongly in my assertions about how fundamental philosophy is. First of all, it sounds self-serving because I'm a philosophy professor. So they almost would expect, well, yeah, of course you're going to think it's so important because that's what you do for a living. But I try to gently get them to see through the presentation how many things that they already are thinking employ philosophical assumptions. They just maybe didn't realize that those kinds of assumptions were themselves philosophical. So as far as being able to inject these things into a local church setting, I mean, there's a lot of different opportunities that you guys are already experts at. Like, for example, doing a conference. What I've discovered at the seminary, we have a national conference on apologetics. This will be our 20th year this October. And I've just discovered that these conferences, and like the SALT conference that's coming up in January, these things have, what they do is I think they get people fired up that come from a lot of different local churches, and then they go back to their own churches. Now, once they get back there, the question then is, what can we do? I've done everything from a Sunday school class where at the beginning of the class, before we got into the Bible lesson, we took an informal fallacy of the week, like begging the question or a red herring, and took about 10 minutes or so to talk about what that was in order to try to introduce the class members to principles of critical thinking. So it could be something as minimal as that, to do an actual, like, presentations like I do, or Sunday school lessons. I actually teach on Sunday nights, except for the summer times, but on Sunday nights in my church, and that actually affords an even more deliberate opportunity to get into issues. It's not always philosophy, but what I've discovered is almost always, whatever it is, it gives me the occasion to talk about the relevance of philosophy in this context, in terms of basic presuppositions about hermeneutics in the biblical text, or views about the nature of God, and how that affects whether we take verses metaphorically or literally or things like that. So, you got conferences, you've got Sunday school classes, you've got special services. Now, one of our recent graduates from the seminary in the PhD program is a local pastor. So he tries to gently pepper his sermons with philosophical truths without necessarily getting so into the weeds that people are just sort of turned off by the how specialized it can get.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. I started this whole process at Tactical Faith about 3 years ago, and what I was really surprised with was the amount of lay people that once introduced to apologetics, you saw kind of the light turn on, and if it's presented in the right way and communicated in the right way, it can not only be a devotional aspect for these people, but there was this aha moment that I kept seeing over and over and over again, and it's what I ended up phrasing "we got smart people too" attitude, which was this confidence that was building amongst lay people, because they get hammered so often in the media or in public opinion that we don't have reasons for our belief. And you throw out a Dr. McGrew or you or Greg Kokelas, who I've used a couple times, or anybody from Stand to Reason or Dr. Habermas, they all of a sudden felt like I can go talk about Christ Jesus because it's worthwhile. That's not to say that their faith wasn't warranted, but they all of a sudden felt like, hey, if this guy believes this, then he, and I know he's thought it through. How much more can I talk about it now in the water cooler? Is that something you've seen too?
Well, absolutely. And in earlier times, what you and I and we all heard apologetics often go by the name need to sort of furrow the ground, people's minds, to tear away, say, intellectual barriers, deal with honest questions, to get people even to a point where they would even consider whether or not what you're saying about the claims of Christ are even true. And so, I mean, there's just no substitute for that. I mean, I think a lot of people have fair and honest questions, and so I think apologetics can do that. Now, the thing that has meant most to me in my life, just personally, was I've also seen what apologetics, and you've alluded to this already, what apologetics can do for the person who's already a believer. Which is to say, like when I went away to college, I'm one of these sort of statistics where you go off to college and X number of young people lose their faith. I was one of those. I went away to college and lost my faith as a very young Christian, and it was apologetics that brought me back to a closer walk with the Lord intellectually. And as you were saying earlier, that gives people this added confidence to be able to go out and be a voice in their community with their friends, family, coworkers, or even strangers to broach the subjects, because now they're excited about looking forward to getting asked the challenging questions, because now they think they have answers, and so it just gives us that much more of an impetus, seems to me.
Well, in your time for doing apologetics and philosophy, what are the changes you've seen in the last 20 years? I mean, I've really only been a part of this whole community for about 5 or 6 years. I mean, I read the occasional Lewis and Chesterton like everybody else has, but I have seen, from my end, even within 5 years, a tremendous growth in apologetic training and the type of people that I meet who are interested in it. And I mean the level of interest where they want to go buy a Reasonable Faith book and dig through it.
Absolutely.
And I've seen that time and time and time again. Are you seeing a similar thing where you're at?
Well, I have. In fact, what's really ironic about how things have tracked for the past 30 or so years is that there's this tremendous explosion of enthusiasm about apologetics among evangelicals. But even as recent ago as the 70s and 80s, a lot of seminaries were eliminating their apologetics courses. I was a seminary student in the 80s at Dallas Theological Seminary, and I would tell people I took all 2 classes in apologetics that was offered at the seminary. But a lot of seminaries were not even offering two. They were starting to just get rid of apologetics, or what would pass for apologetics. They were getting rid of them altogether. And I think looking back on it, their thinking was they saw the culture trending more towards a postmodernism, at least in some pockets. And they mistakenly thought that the old way of trying to deal with objections to the faith was really not the way to go. So apologetics, in their view, was sort of passe, and we need to maybe a different tactic. But it was just the opposite of what was needed. Apologetics was needed all the more as the culture was moving into a post-Christian era, and things that we would have never dreamed about, say, 100 years ago, like epistemological relativism. I mean, we've been contending with moral relativism for a long time as Christians. But when people were finally getting to the point where they were starting to say, well, that's true for you and not for me, and so if Jesus does it for you, that's great, but, you know, it's not my truth, we really had to go, okay, we might need to retool the way we deal with some of these issues, but the need for apologetics is all the more. So what I see has happened since the beginning in the late 80s and 90s is people, it's like simultaneously a lot of seminary leaders and church leaders began to see, yes, the need is greater than ever. And you just now have had this sort of explosion of seminaries that are adding not only courses in apologetics, but now actual degree programs in that. And churches are starting to do conferences and otherwise promote apologetic issues. So it's like a big tide that people can ride. Now, it may have some downside to that, perhaps, that we can get into, but I'm very encouraged about what I've seen over the past 30 years.
Yeah, there is. I did want to move into the negative aspects, but they're few and far between. So much so that, you know, I really don't. It's hard to touch on them because there's just such a momentum building in terms of apologetics. Do you think? I'm not aware of your denominational background, but mine's Southern Baptist, and in a lot of ways, what I had success with, and a lot of my guys have success with, is just reminding a lot of these people in the church. You know, Southern Baptists have been very good in evangelism for a long time, and practical evangelism is something we have been really good at. But we lost something over the last 20 years. What apologetics, and at least in terms of tactics training, like something like Greg Kokel does, it's almost rehashing what we've always been good at. It's just a different type of culture we're going after. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, and I too am Southern Baptist. I wasn't raised in the church, but the kids that led me to Christ when I was a teenager, most of them were Southern Baptists. I'm born and reared in Mississippi. That's why I was cheering about the earlier comment about Mississippi before we got on the air. And I jokingly would tell people in Mississippi there are more Southern Baptists than there are people. So if you stand in one place long enough, you're going to get on a church roll somewhere. You know, the joke that we make about ourselves as Southern Baptists is that we were 3,000 miles wide and a half an inch deep. And what I think that pointed to was the fact that we celebrate the fact that as Baptists we were very keen on evangelism and church growth, but we weren't so keen on what to do with people once we got them in the church. And something that we've had to direct ourselves to in terms of things like discipleship. But I think a part of discipleship, a subsection of that, is apologetics. And off and on, I've been encouraged about what we as Southern Baptists have been doing, but sometimes I get disappointed when the budget requirements, you know, we get rid of certain things at the denominational level that we're deliberately addressing apologetic issues. So rather than think of it on that more grand scale, I tend to just refocus myself on what can I do over the in the sphere of influence that God has put in my life. Just my personal friends, my family, my students, and people that I encounter, and that's the world that I focus on. And you know, so I'm encouraged about the opportunities. I've got a businessman from my church, and he and I meet on 6:30 on Wednesday mornings and do critical thinking for an hour. We're going through some critical thinking books, and he's an aficionado of politics and economics, so we never have a shortage of fodder to talk about fallacies and reasoning when we read opinion columns about, you know, economic policies and things like that. So Any rate, so there's always room for improvement, but I'm very encouraged overall what I see is going on, and not just our own denomination, but others as well.
Hey, Robert, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was listening to the interview this morning, and one of the things she kind of hit on was how in apologetics we can tend to focus so much on it that we forget other aspects of being a Christian. And I was just kind of wondering, what are some real practical things you can do while you're in this to not, in your own life, sort of forget the things that are important, and then at the same time not seem like, hey, it's all apologetics, you guys are losers because you're not doing apologetics or something.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's so important, isn't it? Because all of us probably have a certain kind of temperament and orientation, and that's why we got attracted to apologetics in the first place. So it's not just a pitfall of apologetics, but this can happen in anything. As Christians, we can get so focused on whatever it is that really turns us on that we get maybe out of balance, so to speak. So what sort of keeps my feet on the ground is staying closely tethered to my friends in my local church, because odds are in any given local church, most of the people there aren't doing apologetics. So they appreciate your presence in the local church because you're bringing that you're helping them see the need in their life for apologetics, but at the same time, they're keeping me grounded of other things that God is doing in His kingdom through their giftedness in terms of caring for the poor and visiting the sick, visiting the sick and feeding the hungry and ministering to people around you and counseling. And there's no substitute, I think. There's always a danger to try to segment ourselves off into our own subculture and just run in those circles so much that we forget that the cause of Christ is bigger than just convincing people that it's true. There's the rest of the body that has to train us on, now how do we live that in a practical way. Brad might have a question.
Hey, Brad, do you have a question?
Can't hear Brad.
Can you hear Brad?
How about now?
Oh, you can now?
Okay, good. I think what was happening is, as I was trying to unmute it, you were muting me. We were hitting buttons.
There's a reason for that. Go ahead.
My wife mutes me a lot. Well, what I was wondering is, I've always been more theoretical in my thinking and not always that practical. But things have changed a little bit over the last couple of years since I've taken a job at the University of Mobile, because we have the opportunity, if we want, to organize mission trips to wherever and take teams. And so I've been getting more practical in my evangelism. But what I was wondering, because last year Matt brought Brett Kunkel to the University of Mobile to speak from Stand to Reason, and he does evangelism / apologetics mission trips to places like UC Berkeley. And I was just wondering, given that there's a rich college area, in and around Charlotte, if SES has ever done anything like that, or whether you have in particular.
Well, I really love hearing Brett talk about what he's doing, because it has such a concrete effect both ways in terms of the people that they're talking to and then the people that are on the team that he brought. I mean, the guy is just an amazing, he's so creative in his thinking about these kind of opportunities. We've never done something exactly like that, but we have sort of our version of it. Under the auspices of Simon Brace, our director of evangelism, at the seminary, we have a thing called TEAM, which is Truth, Evangelism, and Apologetics Ministries. And TEAM sends out teams to local churches in the Charlotte area, to China, and everything in between. In fact, I'm going to South Africa in August to do a series of lectures and retreats and things. So Simon is a visionary, and he loves to get practical apologetics as well as the theoretical apologetics into the local churches. And it ranges anywhere from a local church kind of thing to highbrow academic debates and these kind of things. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I've led a couple of trips to India in the last 2 years now, but given that we were out in very remote villages, apologetics just doesn't really come up. They listen to the gospel, and it's very simple. But I've also been really wanting to organize a trip, a little bit like what you were talking about and Brett has done. So I just wondered if whether you had and what kind of success.
Well, one thing that I've discovered, seeing the way Simon has done some things, and this may be something more relevant to perhaps some of the African nations, but the questions may be a little bit different than say, they may not be wrestling with Richard Dawkins, or Christopher Hitchens. But one of the things that the African Christians are being plagued by is this mix of occult philosophy with their Christian faith. And so, because a lot of some of the African Christians are getting saved out of the animistic religions. And there are versions of quote-unquote Christianity even in America. Guise of Christianity. So we've had to do some apologetics. In fact, I'll be doing some of this in South Africa, trying to parse out the difference between a sort of historic Orthodox Christian faith, not only theologically, but also its a worldview context, distinguish that from this more animistic spiritism that they came out of in their indigenous religion, and they're seeing offered to them under the guise of Christianity. So a lot of them are looking and go, well, this Jesus that these people are talking about, he just sounds like one more spirit being in the pantheon. Like, you just added another name, and we got to be careful. So this sort of counter cult type ministry is itself an apologetics. Okay.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with that, because really when I think about it, I guess to a degree we did have to incorporate some low-level apologetics. For instance, when we would use a translator in a village and we were talking about the gospel and that Jesus may have said something or maybe he performed a miracle, the translator occasionally, if we forgot, would remind us that we ought to say, this is a true story. This is a true story from the Bible that really did happen. Or Jesus is the one and only God, reminding them that though they may have a slew of gods they worship, we reject all of them. So, yeah, I guess we were incorporating some to a small degree.
I think you're right. And in other countries, for example, in Italy, we found that what is more pressing for some of the Christians there were moral issues like abortion, for example. Which again, then that's cultural apologetics, where we try to defend the sanctity of human life. Excuse me. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
Yeah, I think Brad hit. Oh, let's see. Are you good to go?
What was that, Matt?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, Brad's touching on something. You might have touched on it when I was trying to get my Cat 5 cable on my net. My wireless is giving me trouble. Brad's touching on something that I thought was interesting in terms of apologetics, even though it's a subset of theology, does touch so many different areas of the church. And is that something as we as apologists need to really start hammering out? Like lately, I've been discussing the matter of spiritual formation with a friend of mine. And where is apologetic training in overall spiritual formation? And is there a conversation going? Well, there's a bigger picture of, where does apologetics, how is it integrated in overall discipleship training? Could you know how to answer that question?
You asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, in the way my mind works, I blur a lot of times issues that people may catalog as apologetic issues with issues that are philosophical issues. So, if I'm thinking of apologetics very narrowly in terms of trying to convince somebody that the Christian faith is true, whether they're already a believer or not, and then apologetics. Well, in that sense, if you're talking with somebody who's they're growing in their faith, they don't need apologetics in that sort of narrow sense where they have to be convinced it's true. Okay, I already convinced it's true. Where do I go from here? But what I see the need is in a lot of circles is if I can get away with using this word, a healthy philosophical grounding for how they do their theology and how they interpret the things that are going on in their life. Like, for example, I've discovered in my experiences in local churches how, I can't even think of the word, just almost bankrupt Bible reading is and Bible interpretation is. In fact, it's so bad in my experience that sometimes if people read other documents the way they read their Bible, the planes would be crashing and the people would be dying on the operating table, these kind of things. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but what I mean is that and I'm not even talking about deep theological issues that even Bible-believing and God-loving Christians can disagree on. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about some basic stuff where people treat their Bible as if it's a stack of Hallmark cards. So they don't understand things like principles of hermeneutics and interpretation. They don't pay attention to context. They don't. People may go, well, gee, this is just standard theology. And it is standard theology, except for the fact that for most of our time as American Christians, we've been able to sort of coast along on a relatively sane philosophical basis. But now that that's starting to be challenged, then we can't take it for granted that when somebody says, well, I think this is true, that they actually do mean that is true. As Brad was saying a while ago, you got to remind them, no, this is really a true story. It's not just, well, sometimes people won't even have a healthy notion of what true even is. In fact, this just happened to me this past weekend in my Sunday school class. I made what I thought would be a relatively uncontroversial statement about trying to get people to face up to reality. Well, I got challenged in the class by one of the adults who, well, I don't like that word reality. I said, what? It's not reality. And she was like arguing. Well, it took me a while to discover that what she was thinking was when she heard the word reality, she was thinking that how people in her life generally think of nothing but the physical realm. So people say, oh, well, I just want to get real. They mean I don't care about this abstract and philosophical and theological. I just care about the concrete physical. So when I used the word reality, she thought I was more or less conceding a physicalism to everybody around. So it took us a while to get over that hump, but it was like, whoa, we got to disconnect here. You don't want to throw away the word reality. That's pretty important. That may be sort of a humorous and extreme example, but I think sometimes it can be maybe a little bit more subtle where people are being adversely and deleteriously affected by philosophical assumptions they've picked up from the culture around them, from the entertainment industry, from their maybe even their own pulpit, and I think a lot of them where it really dovetails into concrete things is in biblical hermeneutics.
Oh, I totally agree. I went and watched that Superman movie, the new one that just came out, and they had this oh so not subtle scene where Clark Kent's sitting there with a Jesus picture in the background, and which was good. I enjoyed seeing Jesus there. Anytime you get to see Jesus in pop culture is really cool. But after he's over, the priest said sometimes you have to just take a leap of faith, before you trust anything. And I usually go to the movies by myself. And I just thought, there's a subtle bit of philosophy there that the church has fed into, has bought into, in that faith is not an act of trust. It's something else, And what culture has essentially done successfully is make truth on one side and this fuzzy faith on the other. And even by just using the word faith and repackaging it as they have, we've bought into it. Even though I have a nonprofit that says Tactical Faith, in some ways I don't even use the word faith anymore. It's almost like a handicap.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
yeah, and the whole discussion about how do faith and reason intersect is a conversation that Christians have been having almost for 2,000 years. So it isn't that there haven't been wise people before us who've tried to parse this out, but too much of our culture today has bought into the notion that faith is inner and private and subjective, and feelings and facts are public and concrete and objective and scientific. So you can have your faith, you just need to go sort of do it over in the corner and don't shove it down everybody else's throat. You've got your hobby, so you don't insist that everybody do your hobby, and you've got your favorite cuisine, so you don't insist everybody has to eat the cuisine you like. And so you've got your favorite religion, don't insist that everybody have the religion that you like. And they don't understand, well, that's not a historical understanding of how faith and reason have related among us as Christians. But a lot of Christians have even bought into this.
Yeah, that's why I think, I'd probably consider myself more of a classical or evidentialist, but I do like the Schaeffer, and to some degree, some of the presuppositionalists have brought the idea of worldview, and I use that concept all the time in local churches as a kind of a primer way of getting them out of that kind of thinking that you're talking about. You can't escape the worldview that you have, the way that you interpret reality, and so anybody else?
Absolutely.
Want to plug in?
Well, yeah, I use that all the time. Having to basically talk about the faith is basically trust. I mean, the word is not separate. It's pretty much the same thing. It's just another way of saying trust. And, I mean, you can trust somebody without any real reason to do it. But, I mean, we talked about that even Sunday as we were talking about, the apostles. And I said, with Thomas, he gets the Doubting Thomas moniker. But and then someone says, well, how can I trust because of evidence? Because, Thomas and Jesus. And I was like, well, think about it. Thomas saw everything that all the other disciples saw. I mean, he saw him raise Lazarus from the dead, saw him walk on water, saw him calm the waves. He fed 4,000. He had all this evidence. Still, he needed to see Jesus bodily resurrected in front of him. So I think that's what Jesus was really, I don't want to say getting on to him about, but kind of saying, hey, look, you've seen me do all this stuff, and yet you still need to see me stand in front of you. And so that's kind of what I'm saying to him is like, it's the difference between having evidence for God and needing to hold God in your hand, And the trust is like, okay, I've got this evidence, so I'm going to put my trust in God to do what he says he's going to do and save me, even though I haven't seen it yet, but I can rationally infer from what I know that, hey, I can trust God. And it's trying to get them away from that whole leap of faith mentality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, faith seems lazy to me. It seems like when you think about trust, the next step is, well, I want to make sure that I can trust this thing that I'm fixing to put my faith into, which makes you want to go find the evidence for where your trust lies. I just hear a lot of people use faith, and to me, it just seems like a lazy step. But
absolutely. Yeah, and it also insulates people from being challenged as to whether or not the thing they put their faith in was legitimate. Because if everybody's just making a blind leap, then nobody's leap is any worse than anybody else's.
Right.
Right. So who are you to say that I shouldn't have leapt the way that I did? Because hey, you did the same thing. You go, no, we're all deciding to trust certain things, but it's incumbent upon us to make sure that what we've decided to trust is something that is trustworthy. Otherwise, it's just credulity. It's not trust.
Yeah, and I think that's important in terms of mentoring and discipleship. At least it has been for me. The way that I have been trying to figure out apologetics in my own life in terms of how it's connected to evangelism is, I have to be truthful with people. I'm not an authority on all things. I can't be. Dr. McGrew came to our state a couple of months back, and he did something for us last year where he gave us a list of things. You don't have to be an authority on all things in apologetics. Pick an area that you like, and then start learning it in depth. Well, I did that, and there's a couple of different things that I enjoy, and then inevitably somebody will come in my life where they ask me a question that involves that, and I can speak genuinely about it because that's where I'm at. All the other things I can kind of give you a common idea, but really I'm just going to point you to somebody else. That's the type of way of using apologetics that I think that's genuine. There is a tendency for us, I think, in our community to feel like we have to have answers in everything. But you start doing that, then I think you end up becoming more of a detriment.
Absolutely. Yeah, that can even lead us to skepticism if you feel. I took a philosophy class under Mary Rousseau, who's a Thomas scholar at Marquette University. She reminded us of the famous line from Socrates, "The unexamined life is not worth living." But she started out the semester encouraging us that the unlived life is not worth examining. And what she meant by that was, because knowing we were all budding philosophy students, and we're all enthused to try to just carry it to the nth degree of every question we can, she reminded us, well, look, there's at some point you're going to have to take a stand. You can't wait until you think you know everything before you make a decision. There's already enough evidence to point to, what it is you need to be trusting. And that's more or less what she was trying to get us to see as philosophy students. Otherwise, you're just on the precipice of this sort of unrelenting skepticism. And you go, well, you really can't live a life like that. And if you're not living your life, what's the point of even examining it in the first place?
Yeah, Dr. Tim makes a good point. He says here, I appreciate the fact that Dr. Bill Craig, has tried to resurrect the concept of reasonable faith. That's a good point. He has tried to take a word the faith word and try to bring it back exactly where it should be.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. Anybody else got any other questions?
Yeah, I was thinking, well, I don't know if maybe this will turn into a question. We'll see where it goes. But it was making me think about when I look at the broad field of what I know in apologetics, there are a lot of areas that have strong evidence for one way or another, and there may be other people who disagree with me on that. One person sees it this way, another sees it this way. But what I like is that more and more people are recognizing that we're building a cumulative case. We may not have 100% certainty in each and every area, but we do have pretty good evidence in lots of different areas that all create this amalgam, I guess, if you will, that helps bolster the case for Christianity. Because I have interacted with certain people, maybe internet atheists, for instance, who will say things like, well, that we don't know that with 100% certainty. What about, all the scientific evidence? And being a biologist, I'm able to launch into that usually and show, well, okay, and I love Greg Kokel's phrase, trying to prove God by science is like measuring how does he say, weighing a chicken with a yardstick. You got to be careful with saying that you can prove spiritual existence with physical measurements, but we all realize that science can at least point to these kinds of ideas like the existence of God, looking at teleological arguments and stuff like that. Yeah, I guess it didn't turn into a question. I can't think of one I was going to ask.
I'm pretty impressed that Greg Kokel could come up with a barnyard metaphor like that.
Especially since he spends all his time on the lake fishing, right?
He might have done that in deference to all of us from the Deep South, He figured we'd all resonate with chickens. And
he doesn't call it the Deep South. He calls it a flyover state.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great point that Brad was making. That in that I try to get my students to see, look, there's a lot of different facets to reality. I mean, you've got biological issues, you've got things in physics, you've got things in history, you've got mathematical, and I think one of the one of the biggest mistakes that gets repeated throughout the history of philosophy are when people try to use a tool and method of inquiry and analysis that's appropriate for one aspect of the real and use that for a different aspect of the real. One of my favorite, now this is going to date me a little bit, but one of my favorite Star Trek interactions is Data's telling a story about when he is falling in love with Tasha, and they're watching a sunset, and he starts to wax eloquent about the physics of the sunset, why it has all the colors in the particulate matter and then splitting the rays of the and she's sort of staring at him with this look like, would you just shut up? And he's telling this in a poem, and he says, and she looked at me, and then we finished watching the sunset in silence instead. And what I take that to be making a point about was that Data was trying to learn the difference between the physics of the sunset, which is certainly true and legitimate, but the physics of the sunset was different than the aesthetics of the sunset. And the faculties in us as humans to appreciate the beauty of a sunset are not reducible to all of the part and parcel of the physics of the sunset. A lot of modern thinking is plagued with this sort of reductionism. Well, a sunset just is, the light rays. No, it isn't just that. It may include that, but there's another dimension of it that's aesthetic that we have faculties of apprehending and appreciating. So keeping those, keeping the kind of ducks in a row, to introduce my own metaphor from a fowl, I think is incredibly important.
Can I chime in and say that I can die now because I just had a hangout where an apologist talked about Star Trek?
Well, it's next generation, so I don't know if that counts anymore. That's the problem.
Well, it counts for me. That's what I do.
Okay, good. All right.
Yeah,
if you come on dressed as a Borg, I would have just shut off and just ended it right there. my life would have been at peak. So, maybe next time we'll do a cosplay of everybody dressed as Star Trek or Star Wars. So
maybe throw a little Doctor Who in there too.
Yeah. Hey, Dr. McGrew, did you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it's going back a little bit right now. Am I on? Can you all hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, yeah. Sounds great.
So I wanted to go back to the question about the word faith. And it seems to me that one of the things that many of us are confronted with when we try to bring apologetics into the local churches is a peculiar kind of deference to subjective commitment as opposed to objective evidence. I have seen examples of this across a pretty wide spectrum, across denominations, where the right answer, according to people in certain churches, including sometimes the pastoral staff of those churches, to any kind of expressed doubt or question or inquiry is to say, we don't ask that kind of question. What's wrong with you? It's called faith. You need more of this, really, they don't put it this way, but blind trust. And that presents multiple layers of difficulty for practical ministry. One of the layers of difficulty is that if you want to talk about reasons, they don't want to talk to you. Another problem is that people, especially young people who ask the questions, get disaffected pretty quickly. One case that lies, I wish it didn't, but within my knowledge, is of a young man who felt he was losing trust in Scripture. So to his great credit, he made an appointment with one of the pastors at his church, went in, and started to explain that there were various difficulties and problems that he didn't really see any way to resolve. Instead of listening to the questions, maybe even admitting, well, I don't know the answer to some of those, but let's look them up. Instead of that, this pastor slid a large Bible across the desk and looked at the kid and said, "This is the gospel. Do you believe it?"
Oh, nice.
And after an awkward pause, the young man looked him in the eye and said, "No. That's why I'm here, asking specific questions." So that's a second dimension of the problem, is that we're alienating people who really want answers. And a third dimension is that we're making people vulnerable to cults, frankly. If it's all about faith, if it's all about feeling, gee, those nice Mormons came along after the storm and they fixed my roof for free. Why shouldn't I hang out with them? If it's all about warm, fuzzy feelings, they'll talk to you about the testimony they feel until the cows come home. And if we leave ourselves no way of differentiating ourselves from such groups, then we have lost. That's just unacceptable. So there are various levels at which this loss of the original meaning of the word faith and the debasing of the concept really get in the way of apologetics ministry. I'd love to hear from anybody who's got good ideas as to how to move forward.
Yeah, it's so discouraging. I mean, I could see where that was going when the young man goes in and talks to the pastor, because I've seen and heard those kind of stories in various ways, and it's really a dereliction of duty of spiritual leaders not to be willing and able to either answer the questions or know where to go to get the answers. But yet, as Dr. McGrew is saying, it's even a deeper problem because they're not even granting the legitimacy of the question. And I think that's probably the worst, because people know these questions are legitimate. I mean, human beings know. You'd almost have to disabuse people of part of their humanity to convince them that the question is not even a legitimate question in the first place. And so we're losing people like that. And I really like the insight that he brought about that almost molds people and makes them vulnerable to the cults, you know, in that respect. So absolutely, yeah, it's a tough. I mean, and as I said earlier, just to finish this thought, I sometimes get discouraged when I think of the task as a whole, and maybe evangelists do this as well when they see a lost world and they think there's so many, almost countless lost people. How do I do it? And somebody else may say, I see so many homeless. And I think the principle is the same. Well, you can't lead the entire world to Christ tonight, but you might be able to lead someone that is in your sphere of influence to Christ tonight. Or you might be able to answer a question or direct someone where to get the answer to someone who's asking the question right now. And you might be able to help someone who's destitute right now. So I have to constantly remind myself, if I just focus on this, I'm already derelict in some respects with that God's given me. So, you know, it's even worse if I try to say, well, let's either do it all or don't get it done. So one mind at a time is what I tell my students. Just one mind at a time.
Yeah, with the Ratio Christi group that I lead, when we invite students to come, we always make sure, especially when there are new students coming in, that it's a safe place to ask questions. We're not going to deride anybody or make fun of them for asking certain questions. This is where they can come, and I love that model, because really that's an element that I experienced very early on when I became a believer. I started attending a church right after I accepted Jesus, and the pastor there was just great, because every time I had a question, whether it was something about the book of Revelation or Genesis or you know, discrepancies or so-called discrepancies in Gospels, he would always sit down with me, and he didn't care whether it took him 10 minutes after the service or whether it took him an hour after the service. He was always willing to take that time with me, and so that's what I like about the Ratio Christi model. And you know, I've heard of some others in the Mobile area. I don't know if they still do it, but there was a church in West Mobile. One of the Ratio Christi directors up in Anniston now, who used to live in Mobile, attended a church where I think every Wednesday night they had like a skeptics night. And so anybody from the community, you could invite them, tell them, hey, if you have questions, bring them, and the pastor and others will try to tackle it. And yeah, it was a huge success. I don't know if they still do it, but it was a really, really cool thing that this friend of ours, Brian, was telling us when he was there.
going back to something earlier that Matt was talking about, kind of the way we started tonight's discussion, I appreciate the fact that he introduced right out of the chute the importance of all of this stuff in the context of the local church. So I see a great partnership that can be there between ministries like Tactical Faith or Ratio Christi and then individual local churches. Because sometimes people may not fall under the radar screen of some of these particular things, but hopefully in the context of a local church that increases the opportunities to deal with people's questions and stuff. I love that Skeptics Night thing. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, that's just, there's so many of us, I've told some of my guys this before, a lot of people there in the apologetic world, in terms of guys that are like me, their whole goal, their goal in life, especially for the younger guard, the ones that are in their 20s that might be coming out of undergrad. Yeah, it's great to go get a master's, and it's great, to pursue a PhD. There's nothing wrong with those things. But how much better is it to just kind of bloom where you're planted, and make your local setting where God has put you that's the place where you put most of your energy. And I went to Beeson, and I did it while I was a computer guy, and I got a master's of divinity. But that entire time, it was almost like God was putting so many things in my life to point me to the local church. That my ministry and everything that I wanted to do was to heal the local church, to bring something to the local church. And for those people that are watching out there, there's about 15 watching at the moment. Can I just lift you up and thank God for you, that you're doing the yeoman's work in the local level, that you might not be getting the accolades of everybody who's on a marquee, but what you're doing in terms of pursuing God's work and extending God's kingdom is just as good as a Bill Craig and his Reasonable Faith. Now, you might not reach the amount of people, but it doesn't really work that way. There's no scorecard here, and that's really kind of what's pushed me. And most of the guys that are in my group, I think they feel the same way. So just in case there's somebody out there watching, that's like us, keep doing what you're doing. There's a movement afoot, there's a grassroots effort going, and just come and be a part of it.
Absolutely.
Well, all right, that's a good way to sign off. We've been here for almost 40 minutes. I want to be a good steward of our time here. For those who are watching, Dr. Howe will be a part of a conference that we're doing that's actually connected with the Alabama Baptist State Board of Missions, and it's a statewide Baptist conference. It'll be held in Montgomery, Alabama. It's been held at First Baptist Montgomery for the last 2 years, and last year was very successful. We've seen a ripple effect, and even to having a Baptist association on board is really big. Sammy Gilbert is the missions director there. Jay Wolf is the pastor. These are two prominent Baptist leaders in our state. And even though Tactical Faith is evangelical, not necessarily tied to Southern Baptist, to have the Southern Baptist start, especially in the state of Alabama, to start thinking in terms of apologetic training, especially with a key church and two key leaders like those, it should be a sign to those that are watching that it can be done, and that things are moving, and to see that the Vacation Bible School is doing an apologetic thing next year should only showcase further how much God is moving in this area. So if you're in the area, if you're in Alabama next year in January, please come along. This is the kind of training that you'll get, and I want to appreciate all y'all who have come aboard. Thanks, Robert and Dr. McGrew and Brad. We want to appreciate y'all coming aboard. So, anybody else got any questions, or we'll sign off? All right. Well, Captain Picard would beat Kirk, by the way. That's how I'm going to leave it.
Absolutely.
Hey, by the way, have you ever thought about you know how they used to do in Next Generation where they would have poker night, which is like the greatest thing on TV. I could watch an entire 2-hour episode of them playing poker. Have you ever thought about the apologetic table of playing poker would be?
I think it'd be great. As long as we don't get in a temporal causality loop, I'm okay.
Yeah, see, I'm out.
that happened during one of their poker games.
Yeah, there you go. Tim's saying we should talk about chess. I'm out. I got nothing to add with chess.
Me either.
All right, guys. Y'all have a great night, and thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Night.
See ya.